I'm Walter Bosley, author of the Esoteric Napoleon, available print on demand only at lulu.com. Chapter 1. Malta and the Knights. The idea of France taking Egypt as a colony was first officially presented in 1777 by François Baron de Tott, an Hungarian born in Chamonix, France, who became a military intelligence officer. At 22 years old, Lieutenant de Tott traveled to Constantinople with his father's regiment and began his career in intelligence collections while tasked to provide on the Khanate of Crimea. In the following decade, he would play a role in inciting the Russo-Turkish War. In 1777, François de Tott was sent to the Middle East on a secret mission to investigate the possibility of colonizing Egypt. Since the time of Francis I, France had made an alliance with Suleiman the Magnificent to oppose the House of Habsburg in the region, specifically including Egypt. This worked until the mid-18th century when the Ottoman Empire began to wobble and the Mamelukes, running Egypt, had made a circus of that. By the time François de Tott arrived in Cairo, he was greeted with a revolution in progress. With the assistance of recruits, Tott collected intelligence on Suez and the coastal cities of the Delta. His analysis proposed Crete as the staging base from which Alexandria, Rosetta, and Damietta could be taken without much effort, and the main force could land at Aboukir Bay. François de Tott considered Egypt virtually undefended, and his proposal, which played up the economic and political advantages while making light of the potential problems, suggested that France simply proclaim itself a friend of the Egyptians, who have come to throw off their oppressors, the Mamelukes. Taking Egypt offered obvious benefits to France, namely blocking or making difficult England's route to and from India. There was also the French economy to think about, as their merchants were already in Egypt and creating trade worth over 5 million francs per year. But few of them had ever tried to venture outside of their walled compounds in a few cities, protected by paid slave janissaries, so little to nothing was really known of Egypt, rife with religious maniacs, Bedouin raiders, and anarchy. Still, the exotic locale and the relics of an ancient civilization might draw the curious and superstitious to such a new colony. Unfortunately, Baron de Tott's report remained essentially ignored with many other Egypt proposals for 2 decades in the Foreign Office. Many proponents of France taking Egypt presented their arguments and plans, yet none were taken up on their enthusiasms. That is, until Napoleon Bonaparte, and more directly, Maurice de Talleyrand. How Napoleon came to Egypt. Most historians tell us that Napoleon was looking for merely his next great conquest, and they leave it at that. Taking Egypt was nothing but military and political grandeur aimed at self-aggrandizement. According to many, Napoleon merely sought to challenge England and launch a conquest of India, both from Egypt. For others, they see Napoleon being given the approval to invade Egypt as a means to get a popular military leader as far from Paris as they could possibly get him during a time of political turbulence. Though all are accurate within a particular context, they fail to pinpoint what lies beneath. Having himself submitted a proposal on the 14th of February, 1798, Talleyrand is credited with applying to the idea its mercantile and political rewards. But there is reason to suspect that it was Napoleon's idea to go to Egypt before Talleyrand's, that there was more to it than the obvious, and that he used the well-known practical arguments to convince the Directory to authorize his expedition. I suggest that Napoleon's intention from the very beginning was to pursue a personal and private objective in Egypt and Syria, as it was known then. First of all, Napoleon had been assigned to a potential invasion of England in which he would have to contend with the British Royal Navy. He reported to his superiors that France's naval forces were in no condition to take on England at sea, and any invasion of British soil should be put off indefinitely if need be, while still projecting the intention to invade. Clearly, Napoleon Bonaparte did not want to waste time on an invasion that wasn't going to happen nor prove successful. He wanted to pursue something more fruitful where all the objectives were concerned. Secondly, Despite the aforementioned proposal by Talleyrand in early 1798, Napoleon had been thinking of Egypt for a while. An opportunity for inspiration predating his time in Italy was when Napoleon was on leave in Corsica in 1791. At this time, Napoleon became the informal guide for a scholar he had studied, Constantin Volney, a world traveler who had spent time in and written about Egypt. As early as spring 1796, French minister Raymond Vernet, upon return from the region, may have actually discussed with Napoleon the circumstances that made Egypt being ripe for invasion. We don't know exactly when Napoleon conceived or was first suggested the idea of an expedition to Egypt, but it could have been sometime after he met Gaspard Monge in 1792. Napoleon had already become friends and was spending much personal time with Monge, discussing science and the like, by the time he and Talleyrand had made their proposals. What else besides the usual objectives might have been on Napoleon's mind? Sir Walter Scott gives perhaps the best hint. He was to be placed far beyond the reach of any command superior to his own, and let his own discretion to the extending conquests, in a country long considered as the cradle of knowledge. The first specimens of early art were also to be found among the gigantic ruins of Egypt and its time-defying monuments of antiquity. This had its effect on Bonaparte, who affected so particularly the species of fame which attaches to the protector and extender of science, philosophy, and the fine arts. Here we have Scott referring to Napoleon's subsequent reputation for dedication to science and philosophy and the like. He also reveals what I am convinced was Napoleon's primary motivation. Egypt was considered the cradle of knowledge. But Scott doesn't stop there, for he provides yet another suggestive bit. Gaspard Monge, mentor. Sir Walter Scott writes, on this subject he had a ready and willing counselor at hand. Monge, the artist and virtuoso, was Bonaparte's confidant, and there is no doubt he encouraged him to an undertaking which promised a rich harvest to the antiquarian among the ruins hitherto imperfectly examined. This statement alone suggests so very much in the argument that Napoleon was not only motivated by ancient knowledge to be gained from Egypt, he was guided in that direction by players behind the scenes. Biographer Andrew Roberts plays off Monge's role in the influence of Napoleon on Egypt as an unsubstantiated personal claim, but I disagree with Roberts on this point. Napoleon's own personal secretary, his school friend Bourrienne, the one who would prove so disappointing later, underplayed Monge's impact, perhaps because he failed to realize how influential the man was where Napoleon was concerned. The younger man responded well to Monge, because, as biographer Alan Shawm writes, Monge offered that unusual combination he, Napoleon, sought: personal disinterestedness, integrity, and a sense of adventure in challenging the unknown. Monge was a rare hybrid of the practical mathematician and the dreamer. His lively imagination permitted fancy and theory to lead him to fresh, uncharted horizons. I'm not certain if I would agree with Shawm's assessment of Monge as a rare hybrid of science and dreamer, as it seems to forget or ignore centuries of philosopher-scientists. But he does appear to recognize the mentor role I see in Monge for Napoleon. Shawm does identify a specific location where Napoleon was supposed to first discuss Egypt with Monge, in Passerano, Italy, in the summer of 1797. I still cannot rule out an earlier influence. Whereas certainly Napoleon did employ an invasion plan incorporating elements from the many which had been proposed before his, I contend that Napoleon was influenced and mentored in the direction of Egypt by associates who shared his deep interest in the science and history and the arcana associated with those two disciplines. I think that Napoleon already had Egypt in his sights before the Italian campaign, and I offer his incessant seizure of documents and artworks as the evidence. The papyrus is the key. It is indeed quite possible that the 1100-year-old Egyptian papyrus was exactly what Napoleon was looking for. Who informed him of this discovery? Who else but Monge, who also pushed Napoleon toward Egypt and her ancient secrets just waiting to be found among the haunted ruins. By the end of this volume, I think you will understand why I suspect this was the case, and also why it involves Templars and Freemasons. The Masonic influence. Freemasonry is rumored to have existed in France since 1688 and can be traced to Paris in 1725, specifically to a lodge consisting of Jacobite and Irish exiles. The Age of Enlightenment was greatly a product of Masonic ideals and operatives, thus Napoleon was born into and likely deeply influenced by Freemasonry, directly or indirectly. He could have been and likely was exposed to some Enlightenment-era ideas and theories about ancient Egypt. By his adult years, he was associated with several Freemasons among his military peers. Due to his personal passions for science and history and the arts, we can presume that Napoleon was influenced by the enthusiasms of many Freemasons where ancient knowledge in general is concerned. After all, Masonry had been instrumental in the establishment of the British Royal Society, and its founder had spent some time in the service of the French court. Just as Freemasons among the philosopher-scientists had shaped the practice and pursuit of science for the modern world to come, they had also pursued the lost technology of the forgotten civilization. I suggest it is safe to say that Napoleon was comfortable with and trusting of the influence of the philosopher-scientists surrounding him. That points to Gaspard Monge, whom one source claims was an atheist, though he was a member of a Masonic lodge and therefore would not likely have been so. Eventually, several of Napoleon's staff and even his own brothers would be Masons, and Masonic lodges would support Napoleon during his reign. If not actually a Freemason himself, Napoleon Bonaparte was a philosopher-scientist at heart and of mind. Goethe said of Napoleon that he was in a permanent state of enlightenment. Napoleon's personal correspondence is full of letters to astronomers, mathematicians, chemists, and biologists, and he could converse on their level. Says Andrew Roberts, "For sheer intellectual capacity and its persistent application in government, there has probably never been another ruler in history to match him." An illuminating statement to consider in favor of the philosopher-scientist aspect of Napoleon is that he once said, "Chemists have a species of powder out of which they can make marble, but it must have time to become solid." That is an incredibly explosive statement in our time of alternative technological considerations in solving the construction mysteries of the Great Pyramid and other unexplained megalithic structures. It is equally interesting that Napoleon claimed to use meditation in some form. He said, "Before entering on an undertaking, I have meditated for a long time and have foreseen what might happen. It is not genius which reveals to me suddenly, secretly, what I have to say or do in a circumstance, unexpected by other people. It is reflection, meditation." This particularly loaded statement by Napoleon will be revisited again. The point here now is that here was a man who, when you look more closely than 2 centuries of caricature will allow, clearly had more things going on in his head than military and political conquest. You could say that those things were almost primarily busywork activity for a mind that never really shut off, and that were used as expedients to apply his civic ideas in a practical manner. With what we call a photographic memory, an early love for reading that lasted throughout his life, and an ability to compartmentalize every facet of his life, allowing for effective focus on any task at hand, Napoleon had likely studied Egypt long before he determined to invade, possibly before his military career led to the option, and he knew where to look for its lost treasures, or whatever personal treasures might lie there waiting for him. Napoleon's personal library just for the expedition consisted of over 300 volumes on science, geography, history, prior voyages, and the Hindu Vedas, and the Quran for the obvious purpose of dealing with the Dark Age mentality of the locals. We're looking at a man who was looking for something in particular. That Napoleon Bonaparte was searching for ancient relics and the secrets hidden among them is obvious to me, not simply from an examination of his personal intellect and the subjects he studied prior to and during the expedition, but from identification of the team he assembled to carry it out. The Savants. For all the insistence by virtually all historians that Napoleon's Egyptian campaign primarily served his political and military aims, there remains the fact that the personnel reflected the other objective I have subscribed to, that Napoleon went to Egypt to find something, and it wasn't political or military glory, at least not primarily. Delegating Gaspard Monge and Claude Berthollet to the task of enlisting an astonishing collection of recruits, Napoleon took to Egypt 167 of the top scholars in the fields of astronomy, archaeology, geography, engineering, physicists, chemists, mathematicians, linguists, medical doctors, and botanists, and 500 field technicians to carry out the tasks assigned to them. We are told that Napoleon threw this team together on short notice, but I suggest he had been thinking about this aspect of the expedition for a long time. Rather interesting is that Napoleon had brought them together under the condition that they were not told where they were going, but told them that their pay would be increased and their positions back home preserved for them upon return. This is a classic scenario for contract employees working on modern classified projects in our times, and certainly this was a sensitive operation even then, for the obvious geopolitical reasons of the day. Still, it is notable. Also notable from the perspective of the thesis of this book are some of the particular experts recruited for the Egypt expedition. Nicolas Jacques Conté, organizer of the 1st Airborne Battalion of balloons, was in charge of mechanics and aerostatics. Guy Dolomieu, a lifelong Knight of Malta, was the lead mineralogist. Captain Etienne Louis Malus, an engineering officer, cannot be identified by specific assignment with any certainty, but his primary scientific career pursuit and achievements involved the physical properties of light and the discovery of its polarization. This trio alone suggests a basic knowledge of subjects popular today with Atlantis scholars: flight, sources of gold and other precious metals and stones, and spectral phenomena. Most historians write off the Savants as part of Napoleon's scheme to merely transplant instant civilization onto Egyptian soil, likely as a means of reinforcing France's claim to the region. I do not disagree that this was attempted. Simply that a territorial claim and the advancement of the scientific establishment of France in the eyes of Europe were what it was all about. I am of the mind that Napoleon's primary objective in bringing these men and their equipment to Egypt was embedded within the overt and very real practical objectives. Napoleon frankly needed the resources of these disciplines to carry out his secret mission, and he got France to make it possible. This was clearly not just a mission of conquest along with which tagged a few scientists. It was an expedition for which science and exploration and archaeological investigation were the eminent concern of its mastermind. Of course, Napoleon's generals were perturbed that these civilians were afforded equal status. Such a large contingent of genius and scientific personnel included in a military expedition was unheard of, even for Alexander the Great, who himself took savants and philosophers on his conquests of Persia, India, and Egypt. An obvious admirer of Alexander, Napoleon had studied Plutarch with enthusiasm while a boy at the Brienne Academy, thus providing the actual first instance of his serious interest in Egypt and her ancient secrets, well before he ever met Talleyrand or had access to the many expeditionary proposals in the files of the Foreign Office. It is not unreasonable to suggest that the Egypt campaign was a culmination of Napoleon's lifelong desire to get to Egypt. So off with almost 200 philosopher-scientists did the philosopher-soldier set sail to gather the remainder of his personnel. There were, of course, practical reasons for Napoleon to go to Malta from a political and military perspective, but I suspect here, as with the Egypt expedition in general, that he had a personal objective for disregarding Baron de Tot's suggestion of Crete and headed for Malta instead. Malta. Of course it was a strategic move to take Malta, a lightly defended island where the oligarchic knights had pissed off the pro-French inhabitants. Good thing for Napoleon that there were pro-French knights among the order, for he said himself his army would not have been able to land if the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta had not opened the harbor at Valletta. The island had withstood 130,000 Turkish cannonballs in 1565 AD. You can read the details of Napoleon capturing the place in numerous historical sources. Our interest here is narrow. More knights. The sovereign military hospitaller order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta had run the island territory as such since 1530. Starting out as the Knights Hospitaller of Jerusalem during the First Crusade, and establishing themselves as a military order in 1099, the Hospitallers were, with the Knights Templar, among the most powerful orders in the Holy Land for a time. When the Templar order was disbanded under persecution in the early 14th century, the Hospitallers were given a great deal of their property and even absorbed some of their knights. By the 16th century, the reformation of Christianity throughout Europe and England, and a slump in their local economy, led to the Maltese Knights taking up a function of policing the Mediterranean Sea against Barbary pirates. This led to the Knights becoming raiders themselves, albeit of opposition ships. In the following century, the Protestant Reformation not only split Christianity, it divided the order, with many knights going their own ways from it. During the 17th century, the Knights of Malta came into possession of 4 Caribbean islands. St. Bartholomew, St. Christopher, St. Croix, and St. Martin were purchased by the order from the bankrupted Company of the American Islands in 1651, and began a 14-year period of involvement with French colonization in the Americas, at the end of which they sold the islands to the French West India Company. This puts Maltese Knights in the Americas to explore as extensively as the order could provide resources. What might they have found? What might they have been looking for? I will return to the question of Knights of Malta in the Americas later, but for now, let us consider why Malta may have meant more to Napoleon Bonaparte than mere strategy and logistics. If you enjoyed this segment of The Esoteric Napoleon by Walter Bosley, you can purchase it print on demand only at lulu.com.